Hey, it's Coach Anderson here again from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. We're going to pick up today with Lesson 3, the war effort at home. We've been talking about World War I, and specifically we're talking about the United States of America's involvement in terms of neutrality. Today we're going to kind of look and see what happens, of course, when the United States of America finally does get involved. Just as we always do, we give you a unit-focused question. The whole unit, of course, is going to be centered around this question, so make sure you make some notes as you go. Remember, we won't address this question too much later, but we will give it in terms of a summative at the end of the lesson, at the end of the unit. Today, we're going to start with the Do Now activity. The Do Now activity has the journal topics that reflect on the quote provided on the First Amendment for free speech and determine if the right is absolute. The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has the right to prevent. It is a question of proximity and degree. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in a time of peace are such hindrance to its efforts that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right. When you look at that, what we want you to do, of course, is reflect on that in terms of what it means here. Is it saying that, according to the First Amendment, of course, we have free speech? Is it saying that in times of war, of course, that the government, of course, can limit those rights to free speech? There are purists in the United States of America who believe that, of course, that all free speech, of course, is protected. So what we want you to do is kind of give you an idea that when we're talking about World War I, we're going to find that this is one of the tenets of America's, Bill of Rights, of course, that will be kind of attacked. So we're going to see how the United States of America handles the limitations on free speech. The vocabulary that we'll have today, of course, will center around these words. And remember, as we go over the vocabulary, if you miss one that we go over, go ahead and look it up yourself, and you can come up with your own definition. The lesson focus question for this question is, what steps did the United States take to mobilize the war effort during World War I? And we will start by talking about mobilizing on the home front. We're talking on the home front, we're talking about at home. What did the American government, of course, do at home, of course, to get prepared for the war effort? It meant getting Americans prepared to make sacrifices and contributions at home so troops could be successful overseas. In other words, the expectation was the patriotic thing to do was American citizens to do without, so the soldiers could have. The American government created government agencies like the War Industries Board, the Food Administration, the Fuel Administration to manage production and civilian consumption of the war and products to include food, gasoline, ammunition, etc. In other words, rationing. So we made sure, of course, that people at home, of course, did without, so that soldiers overseas who were fighting didn't have to do without. Income taxes were raised and bonds were sold, of course, to pay for the war. Here you have the Victory Garden. Americans were encouraged to grow gardens so that commercially produced food could be sent overseas, of course, to allies. So big companies or big farm outfits, of course, that were raising food, of course, for the war effort. So what Americans could do at home, of course, was to plant their own gardens, of course, for their own vegetables, so that they wouldn't, of course, infringe on the people who were allies and then who the soldiers, of course, that were fighting overseas. Mobilizing American industry. American industry was shifted to arms production rather than civilian production. The National War Labor Board was created to implement an 8-hour workday, increase war factory wages, of course, to incentivize workers. Because of those businesses and those factories, of course, having abundant jobs, of course, and a decent wage, a lot of Southern blacks, of course, left the South, of course, and went to northern factories, of course, during a period in our history called the Great Migration to work. Convincing Americans to back the war effort. Just as you might think, the United States of America, was kind of split over this war. There was people, of course, who because we were a melting pot, we had people, of course, who supported the Germans, we had people that supported the British and the French. And what we're going to find is that the government's going to take an active role in trying to shift public opinion in a particular direction, in this particular case, in the direction of the Triple Alliance, or the Allies. The Committee on Public Information was created to shape American public opinion to support the war effort. It was necessary because some Americans sympathized with the Germans, especially in the plains and the Midwestern region of the country. American propaganda in support of the war was distributed through pamphlets and speeches made by the 4-minute men who made 4-minute speeches. And what they were basically doing, of course, is telling you all the reasons why you should support the American war effort. Here's George Creel. He was the head of the Committee on Public Information. He was responsible for those propaganda efforts. And he's also going to be very instrumental in trying to get Wilson's 14 points that we'll talk about a little bit later, of course, approved. Wartime restrictions placed on individual rights. That do now activity that we asked you to reflect on, of course, was a ruling. Some of the ruling, of course, came from this court case, this landmark court case called Schenck versus the United States. And what it basically said that during wartime, individual rights like free speech can be limited. So what we basically do is we adopt this idea that even though we're guaranteed certain rights, of course, under the Bill of Rights, of course, in the Constitution, that during times of war, when the government sees fit, it can restrict those rights. Here's Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes. He ruled in Schenck versus the United States in favor of restricting free speech when it constituted a clear and present danger to the nation. So anything that constituted, in his mind, a clear and present danger could, of course, be limited by the government. Creating the draft for World War I through progressives, though progressives generally opposed the creation of a draft, we did create the Selective Service Act of 1917 to create a wartime fighting force. Some almost 3 million Americans were drafted and another 2 million volunteered. We even had, underage young men, of course, that volunteered to fight in this particular fight and lied about their age, where they were, 18 supposed to fight. In some cases, we had them as young as 17 or 16 that signed up for the war effort. 50,000 American troops died in battle and 60,000 died from the Spanish flu that killed between an estimated 25 to 50 million. So there was a tremendous impact on America and the rest of the world, not only because of World War I, because of the Spanish flu also in the late 19-teens. The roles of American women during World War I. Women were asked, of course, to take on the roles, of course, of men back home on the war, during the war effort. They were asked, of course, to work in the factories, but they also had roles in terms of the military, as non-combatants like nurses, clerks, electricians, radio operations, chemistry, secretaries. By the end of World War I, over 31,000 women had served in some capacity in the Army and the Navy during World War I, not as fighters in non-combatant roles, but still contributed to the war effort. Lesson focus question for this particular question says, what steps should the United States take to mobilize the war effort during World War I? If you remember when we talked about this, some of the things that we said, we did some of these things. Created a War Industries Board to regulate military production, shifted to peacetime, wartime factory production, instituted a draft, started rationing, raised money to fund the effort with bond sales, limited opposition to the war by limiting free speech, and we transitioned women and African Americans to the workforce. All right, that's the end of lesson 3. And what we try to do, of course, in lesson 3 is give you an idea about some of the things that the United States of America, or people in the United States of America did back home, of course, in support of the men, of course, the fighting men that went overseas, of course, to fight. Now, remember what I always tell you, don't take my word for it, go ahead and do your own research because it's American history. And because it's American history, it's your history. We'll see you next time.